Let's talk about Oscar Micheaux's Within Our Gates, released in 1920. So about a year after the Chicago riots. Some have suggested that this film is beholden to D.W. Griffith's A Birth of a Nation. That's a reaction to that film and its very racist assumptions, that it flips a few things on its head. It is most definitely an opportunity for Micheaux to explore segregation, Jim Crow, lynching, alcoholism, gambling, sexism, sexual assault, all kinds of very heavy subject matter. Now, it is an example of a midnight ramble. This is a kind of film created by black producers, directors, screenwriters, and actors that would have then been playing very late at night, often in movie houses, which were not normally attended by black people because of segregation. But late at night, it was another way for those who owned the building to make money. And so people of color were allowed in to watch these films created for them by them. Oscar Micheaux created a number of films, quite a few. Some of them are influenced by fiction written by Charles Chesnutt, a man of mixed race, writing primarily in the late 19th, early and into the early 20th century. He's known for The Gifford Grapevine and for novels like The Marrow of Tradition. In fact, The Marrow of Tradition provides a few situations, scenarios, and images for Within Our Gates. It's not a clear adaptation by any means, but there are some echoes. Within Our Gates came out in 1920 and was promptly lost. It was recovered a number of decades later and is now considered a very, very important film in film history, particularly influential among black creative types in the film industry. Let's look at a few things here. One of the questions I want us to consider, first of all, is the tone of the piece. So it has a lot of very challenging issues that are being addressed. It is not shying away from or making light of murder, rape, these kinds of issues. So it's a little bit odd that it opens with this intertitle card. At the opening of our drama, we find our characters in the North, where the prejudices and hatreds of the South do not exist, though this does not prevent the occasional lynching of a Negro. Okay, this, in case you can't hear this in the language itself, this is incredibly sarcastic. It is kind of dark comedy at work here. If you read Invisible Man or by Ralph Ellison, there are a number of books from this period that Richard Wright's Native Son is another that look at prejudice in the North and suggest that just because there aren't as many lynchings in the South doesn't mean that the North has somehow conquered prejudice, has conquered racism, because it most definitely has not. And so this is, I think, calculated to make the viewer uncomfortable because they feel a tension between what is being said literally and what is actually being intended. The occasional lynching of a Negro, a lynching is where you just bypass the court system altogether and take it upon yourself to kill someone, often with very negligible evidence. And what evidence is often used is so inappropriate to capital punishment that it's absurd. It's very horrifying. So I think we're supposed to be discomfited by this claim from the outset, the sarcasm layered into this. And as we watch the film, we are trying to figure out how we're supposed to feel about what we're seeing. There are highs and lows in this melodrama. We're riding the carnival ride, the roller coaster, as it were. One way into a story is to consider the way that different characters are constructed. And so I want us to examine the way a number of our key figures are introduced. Sylvia Landry is a school teacher. She is educated. We find out later in the story that her adopted parents helped pay for her education despite having very little money of their own. They were laborers and lived in a rural setting, and yet somehow pulled together the money to send their adopted daughter off to school. And Sylvia is actually interested in taking her younger stepbrother with her. And this is in the past. We don't actually know what happened to that brother, whether he made it to school or not. So the question here is, how is her intelligence conveyed? And I think it's important to recognize that Oscar Micheaux is intent on creating heroes who are fallible, who are not perfect. Sylvia is very intelligent in some ways and lacks certain street smarts in others. So she puts herself in predicaments that are hard to extricate herself from, particularly when she visits Boston. So this is the way she is introduced, as someone who was scholarly, bent over a book, right? We're going to see her later on bent over her adopted parents' records, and she's keeping note of how much they've earned, and so they can pay off their debts, presumably. And so here we see her with pages, flipping pages, very intent on absorbing knowledge, someone who's a sponge for knowledge that she then wants to convey to her young charges, the students that she cares for in a schoolroom. This is starkly different from the previous moment, and it only takes place a few minutes after the opening of the film, because what has happened here is she's been betrayed by her cousin, who wants to marry Conrad. And so Conrad is working under incorrect assumptions and lashes out at Sylvia. So she doesn't see that potential violence in Conrad, so her intelligence doesn't go so far as to be able to read his character well enough to avoid the situation. And who can blame her? She's in love, and presumably he's been a gentleman up to this point, so the fury that comes out is unexpected. And here is where we see her intelligence really falter. She is visiting a part of the country that is foreign to her. She's in Boston, and she sees what appears to be a kind gentleman. He's wearing a suit and a hat, and who offers to give her directions because she's trying to find someone. She's searching about for philanthropic, wealthy individuals who will help the school that she works at in the South. And she doesn't recognize that perhaps this person who is very eager to come up and help her might not be trustworthy, right? She's just going to trust people that she runs into, think the best of them. And here we go back to recognizing that she has an abundance of knowledge that she can share with her family, right? She is explaining to them that they could pay off their debts and no longer be cheated by Mr. Griddlestone, Philip Griddlestone. So her knowledge is of practical value. Alma Pritchard, her cousin, is not the most sympathetic individual at the beginning. She welcomes her cousin Sylvia. She seems to be very kind to her, and they seem friendly with one another. Yet the intertitle cards explain to us that Alma has been married before and wants to be married again, and actually has her eyes set on Conrad Drebert or Drebert. He is in the Saskatchewan province of Canada, so maybe the French pronunciation is appropriate here. But she likes him and wants him for herself. So Alma plots to set up her cousin to try to break up that relationship so she can have Conrad to herself. We see her initially as a very poised, well-dressed, attractive woman who presents as a society lady, right? And then here we see her kind of pulling into herself, and it can be a slightly comical to look at the exaggerated facial expressions, but of course this is the silent era, and so this kind of exaggeration is necessary sometimes to convey what's going on in the absence of intertitle cards, or as a supplement to those, to explain the devious nature of this character as she decides to withhold information this telegram from Conrad, which would explain his imminent arrival, to Sylvia, who is not expecting him to arrive when he does. This gives Alma the freedom to flirt with Conrad herself and presumably to tell lies about her cousin, because Conrad, waiting for Sylvia to show up, becomes increasingly nervous and then frustrated and then angry. We don't know what Alma has been telling him, but when he later sees Sylvia with a man whom, if we watch the entire film, we can presume is her father, actually, who's been helping her with her education in addition to the money set aside by her adoptive parents, then we know that there was no reason for him to be upset, right? That's not an affair that he's looking at, which is what he presumes. But he's been misled by Alma. And when Alma walks in on Conrad nearly throttling his fiancée, she reacts like this. She's not thought ahead to what the repercussions could be. I don't think she wants her cousin dead, right? She doesn't want to marry a murderer. That's not the way she would want to get Conrad. And by the end of the film, she's changed sides. She's actually explaining to Dr. Vivian about the history of Sylvia and how her family was lynched, her parents were lynched, her brother got away, she got away. A very horrible situation, which she was nearly raped by her own, genetically speaking, her own father. So she is reconciled to the audience, Alma is, by the end. How are we supposed to feel, though, about these various men who show up? There are a number of them, and many of them are interested pretty clearly in Sylvia. So Conrad is introduced as an academic, as a professional. He seems to be researching a particular area, and he's looking out. He's using this instrumentation and looking out over this vista, taking measurements. So he's established as a successful professional and perhaps an academic early in the film. His reaction to the idea that Sylvia might be cheating on him is, I don't think anyone could really validate what he does. He thinks she's cheating, so he wants to kill her. That's way over the top, although we can understand the emotional reaction, if not the physical manifestation that emotion takes. Larry Pritchard, also called the Leech, is a criminal. He's a diehard criminal. He always gets into all kinds of things, including murder and theft and betrayal and blackmail. And he also likes Sylvia. And she doesn't like him. She tells him pretty clearly, I'm not in love with you, and rebuffs his advances. And despite this, or perhaps because of her rebuffing him, he tries to blackmail her later on by threatening to betray some kind of information, which we can guess at. Philip Gentry is law enforcement. You'll notice in this image that we see some black athletes on the wall here, so someone who appreciates what other colored people have accomplished and himself is a professional who is given information about Larry, the Leech, so that he's on the lookout for him and finds him immediately after reading this telegram about the Leech moving from city to city. The Reverend John Wilson is an important figure because he's a foil for Old Ned, the preacher that we see in the Boston area, who is inclined to discourage his congregation from pursuing suffrage voting rights. The Reverend John Wilson wants to educate black people, and he's focusing on the youth. He and his sister have taken to sacrificing much of their own wealth to try to educate the rural population. So he's an important figure who also falls for Sylvia. There are moments where he's looking longingly at a photo of her, and it's very clear that he wants to be with her. He later adopts the role of suitor in pursuing her romantically, but she's not interested in him either. So she keeps on rebuffing different people who are making advances until she runs into Dr. Vivian. And you probably noticed that she and Dr. Vivian daydream about one another a number of times following their first encounter. Dr. Vivian is introduced as a professional and someone who reads a lot, so an academic of sorts, and that he's always trying to fill his mind with more knowledge about different inroads that are being made by Theodore Roosevelt. He, towards the end of the film, is telling Sylvia about all the different things that, all the different advancements that Black people have made by serving in the military and so on. All hope is not lost, he's telling her, despite the things that you've been through, Sylvia. I now know about your past. He's a very caring individual and who rescues her early in the film and continues to pursue her. Okay, so just a few things to be looking for in the film. I want to draw your attention to just a couple technical advances in early film. One is cross-cutting. And this is when you are cutting back and forth between different scenes that are supposed to be happening simultaneously. But they're not proximate. They're not close to one in space if they are in time. So cross-cutting is used to great dramatic effect by, say, George Lucas in the Star Wars films, right? Usually in the last 30 minutes of one of these films, the Star Wars films, you're moving back between 2, often 3 or 4 different scenes, which are all happening concurrently and sometimes converge on one another, the events of these different scenes. So let's think about why Micheaux is cross-cutting between a speakeasy where alcohol is being served and the gambling is happening, and Sylvia and Alma sleeping in the living room. These scenes couldn't be further apart thematically, one would think, and yet somehow they are linked here. This is one of a few scenes where Micheaux suggests that the supernatural exists in some form or fashion. So they're dreaming, and apparently Alma is actually dreaming about what is happening. She sees in her unconscious mind's eye this guy, Red, he's a professional gambler, get killed by Larry. And when she wakes up, she believes the dream enough to distrust Larry the next time she sees him. So she trusts her instincts. She trusts this almost, I wouldn't say prescient dream. It's like a window into reality that's happening far away. And she enters through this portal during REM sleep, during a dream. Here we see 2 very affluent white women, one from the north, one from the south. So we have Mrs. Geraldine Stratton from the south, who's very prejudiced against Black people, and Mrs. Elena Warwick from the north, who seems like a natural philanthropist, wants to help those in need, and runs into Sylvia because Sylvia was run over by Elena's own carriage. Not fatally, thankfully, but they definitely knocked her for a loop. And so she wants to make up for that and help her in whatever way she can. So this is a meeting of old friends, right, who have very different temperaments when it comes to political issues. In fact, we discover that Mrs. Geraldine Stratton does not even want women to gain the right to vote because it would allow Black women to vote, right? So her racism leads her to being a bit sexist. Here we see Dr. Vivian pondering. He's often reading and then thinking. Sometimes he's thinking about his love interest, Sylvia, but other times he's thinking about what he might be able to do to help the cause of Black people. So we have a white woman and a Black man who are both intent on trying to advance what would have been referred to as a colored people's agenda, or sometimes they're referred to as Negroes in the period. That's colloquial. That is the language used at this time. And here we see them conferring. Now, by this point, Mrs. Geraldine is reconsidering. I'm sorry, this is Mrs. Warwick, who is reconsidering because her friend, Geraldine, has tried to discourage her from giving money to the young Sylvia. So all of these scenes, which seem unconnected at surface glance, are actually interacting with one another. Here's another example of cross-cutting that pulls together a pulpit scene where we just saw old Ned preaching, followed by a shot of the congregation. So a shot reverse where we first see the preacher from the position of the congregants, and then we see the congregants here from the position of the preacher. That's called shot reverse. And we see someone who is reaching into his pocket so that he can give money, because old Ned has just been asking for money. Now, unfortunately, for the congregants, they're not necessarily giving money to a good cause. It is clear that old Ned is out for himself. And there are many churches that take up money so that they can help the poor, those who are in crisis situations, and do that on a weekly basis. And this might not be one of those kinds of congregations. I imagine that the Reverend Wilson Jacobs congregants that church is a more altruistic church, but this one, maybe not so much. These people are being guilted into giving money. This is not cheerfully, freely given. So they are being shamed into it. Old Ned has just said that somebody took something out of the box, the plate as it was being passed around. And so people are trying to make up. Maybe a number of them are guilty, but they're all reaching into their pockets and giving back money. So that is juxtaposed against this shot of Sylvia trying to reach out once again to Mrs. Warwick. And Mrs. Warwick is turning away from her because she's wondering whether she should give the $5,000 that she had been thinking about giving. Now, as it turns out, she ends up giving $50,000 because she changes her mind yet again. And judges Mrs. Stratton to be narrow-minded, her friend. But we see people being asked for money in both these situations. So pecuniary considerations, funding, is the connective tissue between these different scenes. And here we see Ned being swamped by congregants who are eager to put money back in the plate. Here we see Sylvia daydreaming about looking out a window with Dr. Vivian. He has similar daydreams. And then it cuts to old Ned, who's warming up to some white folk who are in the habit of giving him money. It's almost like they are paying him to keep the black congregation down so that they're not asking for more political rights. So very, very, very sad what he's up to. And he actually judges himself when he steps out this door and says that he's selling himself for a mess of pottage. He uses biblical language there, and that hellfire is going to be the consequences of this betrayal, this hypocrisy. So what is the connection between this and this? I think here, instead of it being thematically similar, we are seeing a divergence. We see Conrad and Sylvia freely entering into a connection, an intimate connection, because of shared affection. The shared affection that we see being played out here is utterly false. He is playing to these guys' prejudice, old Ned is, and he allows them to literally kick him in the butt, and he just laughs it off. This is a performance that apparently has happened before. He is denigrating himself, dehumanizing himself to get some money. And then we're back to Sylvia daydreaming about a meeting of the minds, about a relationship that is actually a connection of equals. And then this is hard. This is really hard in the film. And I will use this as a reminder to you to, if you're concerned about certain very distressing material, to take advantage of the links that I have on the Path 1 calendar to parental advisories, which at IMDb, which can serve as warnings, for trigger warnings, content warnings, right? For those of you who might be triggered to relive some of your own trauma. Or perhaps you haven't been through something, but you're just really sensitive to it. Just remember that is an option if you want to know what's coming. So this film was banned. It was not distributed widely. There were a number of people who thought it would stoke the flames of racism and lead to riots because of the lynching and the sexual assault here that we see between a white man and a black woman. So Micheaux is flipping things. Oftentimes, as in The Birth of a Nation, Griffith is drawing attention to the idea of the burly black man. This is the way they're often referred to in literature, who is threatening the chaste, white, innocent woman, right? Micheaux flips that dynamic, and here we see what we know happened often in the time, in the 18th and 19th century under slavery, is white men assaulting black women and sometimes conceiving life that way. So here we see one of the Griddlestones, this is Armand, who is taking the opportunity of the chaos that's happening with the lynching to seek out a victim, and he finds this woman is going to rape her. And this is a very distressing scene to watch because he's chasing her all over the place and she is just desperate to get rid of him, and her clothes are being torn and she's throwing things at him. And I think one of the more distressing elements of this is that her desire to fight back alternates with a learned helplessness. At moments she looks like she's just giving up, and then she'll find it within herself to fight again, and she's swinging back and forth. But this is very emotionally distressing to watch, and it's being intercut with a bonfire where her adoptive parents their bodies are being burned. So it's not intercutting with the lynching or the preliminary bit where they've tracked them down and they're stringing them up, but the actual bonfire. So instead of two different kinds of assault, we have an assault and the disrespect being shown to these corpses. It's like it's not enough to just kill them. They have to burn their bodies, right? Their bodies are being immolated. They are being destroyed, reduced to ashes. I think one way to read this juxtaposition is that something within Sylvia is not just being assaulted, but is being killed, is being destroyed, is being burned to ashes. She is seriously traumatized by this. And even though we see her smiling at different times in the film, and she's given herself over to children, to their care, the idea of her being in a romantic relationship, I mean, she's rebuffed a number of guys. I mean, Conrad, she trusted him, she let him into her life, and then he assaults her, so he turns violent. Her trusting anyone again is going to be difficult, and I think that's why Conrad has Dr. Vivian has his work cut out for him. And even though she's been daydreaming about him, committing herself to someone is going to be hard, and he's trying to convince her to have hope in them, and hope in the future of America. America can be a place where we see white people and black people working alongside one another. He points out a number of different examples from recent history. He's very hopeful, and he tries to encourage her to be optimistic in the same way as she looks to their future and the future of the country. Let's just talk briefly about transitions. This is a supplement to the introduction to film terms that I gave you before. This is an example of a transition where we are dissolving from one scene to another. And the dissolve is appropriate for Dr. Vivian because he's an approachable character, a very genuinely kind and patient and stalwart, courageous fellow, right? Who steps in to a number of situations. He actually not only helps Sylvia when she's had her money stolen from her, but he also, we see later in the film, helps out Larry Pritchard, the leech, a criminal, and tends to his wounds when he's been fatally shot. And he doesn't save him or anything, but he does care for him. So a good guy who's willing to help anyone in need. Here we have a fade in from black, right, from darkness. And sometimes this is used to introduce characters whom we don't necessarily want to trust. This is right after Larry has attempted to blackmail Sylvia, and I'll leave it to you to try to figure out what he might be attempting to blackmail her with, what knowledge he threatens to divulge. So this is after the blackmail, and you can see now that his stepsister Alma is not that comfortable with her stepbrother. She is not. She's concerned about him. She thinks he shouldn't be there. It's dangerous to remain in this town, and she is desirous of his leaving. And of course, he leaves to go commit another crime. So, and then we get the fade out, right? He's heading off to do things under cover of darkness, and we see him trying to crack a safe in a darkened room with a flashlight in one hand. The iris in is used often in this film to introduce something new. Sometimes it's a new character, sometimes it is a new setting, sometimes it's a different moment in the storyline. It's like it introduces a flashback. This is the way we are introduced to the studious Sylvia bent over her work. This is the way we're introduced to old Ned, the preacher, whom Mrs. Geraldine Stratton has just been waxing eloquently about in trying to convince Elena Warwick to give her money to old Ned. Why don't you give him $100 instead of giving $5,000 to this black school in the South? When Sylvia's past is being revealed, it begins with an iris in. And iris out functions, I think, very effectively here as Ephraim is being betrayed by the white people whom he thought he was cousining up close to by betraying a black man. Well, I mean, he didn't actually see the shot fired, but he's betraying like one of his own instead of trying to cover for them or assuming the best. He assumes that Sylvia's adoptive father, Mr. Landry, actually shot Philip Griddlestone, right? And so he's the one, Ephraim is the one who tells everyone about this. And he thinks, I'm in their good graces now. But then when they can't find a black person to lynch, they decide to lynch him off screen. And as they're leading him off to lynch him, the camera closes like this, as if there's a target on his back, right? The iris out is often used to suggest that something is ending in a terminal way. It gets smaller and smaller. All right, till next time.